places near or slightly above average. Wetter as you go to the southeast, especially Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Missouri, well above average. Then, of course, the one that stands out in North Dakota being well below average, and in March, for what they're looking at for flooding, that was most welcome. March temperature ranks in general, mild March, most places above average. There's a few places that were a little cooler, but overall balanced out to be a warm March. Northwest Minnesota was a little bit cooler, but the rest of the state tugged it the other direction and made it warm. So March was kind of out like a lamb. Precipitation, again, a wide variety of near average to above average, and of course North Dakota below average precipitation. Missouri was wet, Wisconsin was wet as well. So a few areas, kind of a mixed bag, you know, depending where that storm track set up or who got the snow and not got the snow. So kind of what's going on in the last 30 days or so is really winter versus spring. Spring started to get an early start, but winter began to start creeping back into April, especially as you go north and west. The departures below normal, North Dakota, you know, into South Dakota a little bit, and then above normals you go farther southeast. Once you get to Kentucky, well above normals. So kind of a northwest to southeast gradient with the temperature, and that kind of continues to this day, except more below normal, pushing to the southeast. Precipitation wise, wet in places, especially in the south, the southern Missouri on over to into southern Kentucky, a little bit Ohio too. So there was areas that were well above normal precipitation. Wisconsin was fairly wet too. In Minnesota, wet in the southeast, a little drier as you go through the middle part, and of course dry in Kansas, and also Colorado too, when they would have liked to see a little precip there. Looking at soil moisture percentiles, and this has been going on quite some time. We've been having wet soils for at least the last couple of years. In general, 2018, 2019, now 2020. A wide swath of areas are in the high percentile for soil moisture ranking. Now, note there is a little bit of surface drying as you dig deeper into the data, although the deeper soil profile remains wet. Something to highlight is notice the dry spot in Colorado, especially in the Eastern Plains area of Colorado, even going into Kansas a little bit. Some drying now, a little bit of drying maybe for the ag areas isn't unwelcome. We'd like a little drier soils, especially where it's been so wet. So something to keep an eye on. It's only shallow right now, but you know, it doesn't take long to start degrading a bit if we have the right conditions. Topsoil moisture, this map it could be a little confusing. This is looking at the percent surplus of the soil moisture by state compared to last year at this time. So it's been so wet, you'd like to see some negative numbers here, like at Minnesota and also Iowa and Wisconsin. And so it's still plenty of surplus of soil moisture. It's been a while since we've had really dry conditions for the bulk of the north central region. The exceptions, of course, Colorado is quite dry, and you can see Kansas is starting to get a little bit lower in the surplus. But you can see there's a lot of variety too. Some places are still quite wet. So looking at the 28-day average stream flow, this was from yesterday, still a lot of high stream flow values in the upper Midwest, and falling stream values, places like Illinois beginning to get back down to more of an average flow for this time of year. Still elevated flows in many places too, especially where the snowpack melt is now over, but the water is still running into area streams. So Drought Monitor, past 2 months. The first map there is from February 18th. The second map is the one produced this week. Not much change overall. It's been, I think I looked at this is like the second longest stretch of no drought conditions in the for the Midwest Climate Center area. I'm not sure exactly how long that is. I think for us in Minnesota it goes back to September. We haven't had any drought conditions, so been quite some time. Do notice a little bit abnormally dry now, poking into northwest North Dakota there. And of course, the big story for the drought is what's going on in Colorado. They've got severe drought down there, and it has expanded a bit over the last 2 months. So past 2 months, looking at the change, there's been one category degradation over Colorado. Most places haven't seen any change. It's just been so wet. So, but some concern is the spread of the drought in Colorado, and that's an area of concern there. Throw a little bit of snow depth out there. Yes, we still have some snow on the ground, and actually it's snowing right now in southern Iowa, moving into Illinois. And that's been the pattern for this April. Not necessarily a good thing to see a lot of snow in April. It does happen in most states, especially Iowa and northward. Having April snow is not uncommon at all, but when people get a taste of spring, they think that's what it should be for the rest of the spring. So there's been some complaining about that. So there is still some snow on the ground here and there, and more falling in parts. Luckily, the April sunshine is very strong, so if it does come out, it tends to melt pretty quick. And looking at the Missouri River Basin, the mountain snowpack water content, this is from this week. Still building a little bit. Typically, normally it peaks about middle of April, and we might not quite have reached the peak yet. They're still adding a little bit more snowpack to it. Of course, April's been cold now, so there's been a little bit of adding on to the snowpack, so it could go up a little bit more before it starts on that downward curve beginning later in the month and into May. So we'll have to wait and see there. The Platte River Basin mountain snowpack water content for the middle of the month too is also building and a little bit above the average, so running 104% of average. North Platte, the South Platte, about 101% of average. Typically also reaches a peak about the mid-April area, but we still might add just a little bit more to that before it starts its downward trend too. High water levels in the Great Lakes have been an issue for quite some time. It wasn't so long ago we were complaining about low water levels in the Great Lakes, but the last couple of years it's been higher. Lots of consequences with this. This is Lake Michigan in Door County last year, and the beaches were definitely smaller. I saw people, some pumping out basements that would probably normally be dry. Of course, there's been beach erosion. And also issues whenever the waves kick up too. Looking at it a little more closer, here's the latest measurements and the forecasted water levels. This is a product that's updated at least once a month, if not more. And you can see I highlighted a few of the parts, the differences from the long-term monthly average. So this is the high water levels for April 10th. At least the forecasted high water levels. So we're looking at from April, the long-term monthly average, Superior's 2 feet above, or sorry, about 14 inches above the long-term average. Michigan and Huron, 3 feet above the long-term average. And the Great Lakes are currently undergoing where they typically rise this time of year. The projected change for next month is going up, so they're not too far away from the record highs, and in some places like in Erie, they have reached the record highs there. There was very little ice across the Great Lakes this winter. Compared to 2019, there was quite a bit more, and in some recent winters, 2018, there was more ice. This was very scant ice in Superior. And other Great Lakes too. We just didn't have that much cold air around and the right conditions to form the ice. So ice off was quick. So we'll have to wait and see what happens and what the weather brings going into the summer for the Great Lakes. Some state impacts around the area. Some places have had a good jump start to the spring. And some places it's kind of come screeching to a halt. In general, probably the biggest story is the cold air we've had mid-April. Below freezing minimums in many states, April 13th through the 16th, even this morning, plenty of cold air. I reached out to many places to see if can find some impacts and damage to fruit trees, especially fruit trees that have already blossomed. We were running ahead of spring for the phenology across many places because we had a mild March, and beginning of April was mild. But then once the cold air came in, that's when suspected there could be some damage. Michigan, Nebraska, Kansas, Indiana, and pretty much anywhere where the flowers began to bud and bloom. Could be some alfalfa wheat impacts in Nebraska. And in Minnesota here, we had ice out progress was going quite along, but now it really is stopped. Here's the National Phenology Network showing the spring bloom index anomaly running, as you can see, on the early side and not the late side. And I noticed I looked at it this morning and it pretty much had stopped moving. So the cold air is starting to have an impact on the progress of spring. But the areas where you see the line there where it was early is probably some of the areas to keep an eye out for possible damage to fruit trees, and hopefully they're able to escape through this cold okay, but well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Just highlighting how cold it's been. Here's the minimum temperature plot for ending the morning of the 14th, so this week. And this was one of the coldest nights. It's been cold here and there for many of them, but as you can see, many places were in the middle 20s. Up here in Minnesota, we had teens and maybe even a few single digits. Looking at some record lows, there definitely were some. The Twin Cities here yesterday, we just missed a record low. We had 19 degrees, the record low was 18, and that's records go all the way back to the 1870s, so a long period of record there. But some places did set not only low minimum records, some low maximum records, and some had both. So, and you could extend this westward into Nebraska and Kansas as well. They've had the same cold air as the rest of the Midwest. Looking at a few spot states, we'll start out east, Kentucky and Ohio, plagued by those mid-20s for minimum temperatures, and probably more significant, had extended periods in below freezing. It's a kind of an hours game. The more hours you are below freezing, the greater the chance you could damage sensitive horticultural products. Concerns about the specialty crops, again, alfalfa. Last few months have been wet and some shore flooding around Lake Erie. If you look at the plot on the right, that's the percent of the mean precip from March 1st to March 31st. You can see how wet it was in southern Kentucky. Also central Ohio was wet as well, but not universal. Some places were a little drier. Northern Kentucky, a little bit drier. Michigan moving north. Some good news for the winter recreational front. They had ample seasonal snow up in the UP in northern Michigan, the place where people go to have fun in the snow, the snowmobile and ski. And then less snow was in the south, which was actually a benefit to the people who have to remove snow. Probably the people have to pay to remove snow, and maybe not the people that make money off removing snow. So it could go both ways. There was a large hail event on April the 8th, and pretty good size hail, 2.5-inch size hail. Fairly uncommon to see in Michigan this time of year, large hail. And also some good news, some recent dry weather east and south did assist field work and planting of sugar beets and oats. So where it dried out, farmers were able to get out in the fields pretty quick. Illinois, the recent cooler April is causing problems with snowy and icy roads. This is a picture of a pretty good crash on Kennedy Expressway near Chicago, or in Chicago, just the other day. So when it snows, it causes trouble. Some good news, drying out a little bit in western and central Illinois. And it's probably a good thing because when it dries out, you can warm those soil temperatures, which is what we're going to need. You want to get out in the fields, but also watching to see how dry it gets. Eventually, it could become an issue. Iowa and Missouri, again, plagued by the cold, might have damaged some tree fruits like apples. Both Iowa and Missouri Sounds like grapes might have escaped the extreme cold. Some planting had begun when the soils were warm. There were some soils that had warmed into the lower 50s in Iowa, but then right when the cold air came in, cooled off those soils, and now the progress is beginning to slow. Minnesota, March was mild, except up in the northwest. Thankfully for folks on the Red River, it was also dry in the northwest in March, wet in the southeast part of the state. And phenology, lake ice out progress was a week ahead of the median in Minnesota and 2 weeks ahead of 2019, but now everything is pretty much stopped, and we were at median this week, and now we'll start falling behind next week if the cold air continues. April began mild, but then turned cold and snowy. Kansas and Nebraska, some record cold again with lows in the 20s. Freeze warnings posted now for Kansas, so the cold air is ongoing. Very busy field work before the cold event, now falling behind. Drying out, but still decent soil moisture, especially in the deep profile in Nebraska. Calving season went well. Heard that from other states too. The winter wasn't very bad. The blizzards weren't too bad this late winter. And one interesting note, it was quite foggy at times in March, especially in Kansas, as you can see in the picture there. Colorado is where the drought is. Severe drought south and eastern plains. There's been some problems with grass and brush fires and also blowing dust. Wheat was reported poor condition Keona County, and I kind of highlighted it on the map there with that arrow. Interestingly enough, the urban corridor by Denver and Colorado Springs, precipitation is close to normal. So there is a drought, but it's not universal throughout the entire state. Changing gears a little bit, we'll go to rivers and streams. This is a look at the Mississippi River at St. Paul when it peaked on last Monday, I think. That's what minor flood looks like in St. Paul. Not a big deal, and much lower than it was last year in 2019. So it was definitely on the better end of what could have happened on the Mississippi in St. Paul. Looking out in Ohio Valley, one interesting flash flooding event of note on March 20 in the Columbus area. The South Fork of the Licking River set a record. That's right by I-70. There were some deaths in that flood in March 20. A bridge got washed out, so there was definitely some issues with that. Now it's kind of settling down. The rivers are what they'd say normal flood risk now. Still minor flooding is possible if we get the rains. Okay, upper Mississippi River Basin. We're on the tail end of the snow melt. Most of the snowpack has been melted a week or two ago, and now the peaks are flowing down the main stem of the Mississippi. Right now it's near Muscatine, Iowa. That's in the southeastern part of the state, where it's moderate, transitioning to minor at Keokuk, Iowa. So the Mississippi is now on its way down in most places. Red River in the north, there was a lot of concern about this spring. Right now the peak is currently near Drayton. Also was within a half a foot of record, about the fifth highest. I saw on Facebook a speedboat racing across the flooded farm fields around Oslo. Was very interesting to see how they cope with the flood up there. Oslo is surrounded by a giant ring dike, so they're used to this up there. So you know, it could have been a lot worse. There were definitely impacts. I-29 between Manville and Grafton was closed, and Pembina is still on its way up. Peak will happen probably next week or two there. So there's still the slug of water moving north into Canada. Missouri River Basin still has an enhanced risk for flooding. It's still flooding right now on the James River. That's what I have circled there. As was the case last year, especially in eastern South Dakota, soils continued to be very wet. And what really helped out for this spring flood was a fairly dry and fairly warm March assisted quite a bit. We did not get excessive precip in March. The snow melt was almost optimal, very slowly, gradually melted away and without anything really on top of that. Overall, the main flood picture was very thankful that we had a good snow melt. Let's look at the future. Climate outlooks. We'll look at the next 7 days, and then 2 weeks out, what's happening in May, and then the longer outlooks, May, June, and July, and then June, July, and August. So the 7-day precip forecast that takes us out for the next week till next Thursday has most of the activity in the southern region of the north central region. So basically from Kansas through Missouri into Illinois and Indiana. Virtually no precipitation is expected over the next 7 days in the upper Midwest area of North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So the storm track to the south. Looking ahead for the next week, 8 to 14 days, above normal temperatures have a tendency for above normal temperatures to return across basically South Dakota through Nebraska into Kansas. Normal type of temperatures across areas to the east, and then the Great Lakes still poised to be below normal for temperatures. As for precipitation, the map on the right there has a tendency for above normal precipitation, but it's not a very strong signal. It's on the lowest end of above normal, so it doesn't necessarily mean a parade of storms. The highest probability is way off in the southeastern part of the U.S. So at least up here in north central region, above normal is a slight tilt for above normal precip. Looking ahead for May, temperature-wise, equal chances. So basically a three-sided coin, above, below, and normal across the entire area. Precipitation still have a bullseye of above normal precipitation, basically from Illinois to Ohio, and then lesser chances for above normal precipitation as you move northwest from there. And unfortunately for Colorado, below normal precipitation looks like a tilt towards that, especially in the southwestern part of the state. The Climate Prediction Center outlook that takes us spring through early summer has more of the same kind of pattern, just a smaller area of equal chances across the heart of the country. Most places in the country will have a tendency for above normal temperatures, not so in the upper Midwest. Then precipitation-wise, still a tilt for above normal precipitation for the start of the summer. Looking ahead for the next 3 months, June, July, and August, still has about the same kind of pattern, equal chances for above normal and below temperatures, and then above normal precipitation, especially favoring Iowa through Ohio and places south, then equal chances there, across Minnesota and going back through Colorado. So the drought outlook takes us into the future here. What's the tendency for the period that goes through the end of July? So basically, the outlook is for drought to persist across southern Colorado and into far western Kansas. So the drought that's there is predicted to be there. Not much expansion noted, though, at least in the outlook through midsummer. So the outlook summary, what has been there for the last 2 years, soils remain wet in many areas, except parts of the west, especially Colorado. Below normal temperatures north and across the north and the Great Lakes, pretty much for the rest of the month of April. And then equal chances for below normal and above normal temperatures this spring and early summer. Above normal precipitation, except in the west. And for further information, there's links you can check out. You can look at the Climate Prediction Center. If you want more outlooks going all the way till next year, you can do that too.
Yep. Hey, Pete, go back up one, would you?
Certainly. Whoops. There we go.
There you go. So those top two, if you want to get a PDF of this, of Pete's presentation, you can go to one of those two sites at the very top. I know there was a question about that. If you don't get regular emails from, I guess from me mainly, doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and you want them, which would include information like this on a monthly basis and some other regional climate information, you can get on the list, if you will. A number of you are already on that, I understand, but if you're not, and you want more information, sort of climate-related information, you can do that. Just write to me, my name, doug.cluck@NOAA.gov. I'll put you on the list. And go to that final slide then. Thanks. And there's Dennis who's on, there's me, there's Pete Boulay if you have any specific questions, Mike Timlin at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and Natalie Umflett if you have data needs at the High Plains Regional Climate Center in Lincoln. Mike's in Champaign, Illinois, and Brian Fuchs, who's actually on the call. Well, I might actually add unmute, because he had some comments about how rare drought has become in the last few years in what we call the central region or the north central part of the U.S. So Brian, if you're willing to say a couple words, I'm going to unmute you. There you go.
Yeah. So can you hear me, Doug?
I can hear you. Get
All
close
right.
to the speaker, though.
Okay, I'm up there close. Just coming, I caught Pete's comments about how rare, or we just haven't had a lot of drought in the region. And so during that discussion, I kind of looked up some of the stats from the U.S. Drought Monitor webpage. And in the Midwest region, so that would be Mike Timlin's RCC region, we have not had drought in that region since November of 2019. And we haven't had more than 20% of the Midwest region in drought since May of 2015. And then I looked at the entire North Central region, and I also found out that for the entire North Central region, so that's from Montana to Ohio and down to Kansas, including Colorado and Missouri, we have not had 20% or more of the region in drought since August of 2018. So realistically, we've been in a pretty benign drought pattern, probably having a lot of people let their guard down with regards to drought. And this year's really not changing that as we speak, but 2012 kind of started the same way, but I'll leave it at that.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Now we'll get to some of the questions. Brian with the National Drought Mitigation Center, by the way, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Some of the questions I sent, there were a couple questions that, well, just let me go back just a minute, and hopefully everybody's hearing me. Am I breaking up or anything? Do I sound good, by the way?
You sound good, Doug.
Okay, thanks. I've heard from a few folks on the line, and believe me, it was a struggle getting this webinar up. Don't know what was wrong at the national headquarters or whatever, but the audio and the whole thing wouldn't come up. So if we're having issues, I apologize. Sorry. It's kind of the way of things these days. A little bit on the flooding angle that Pete talked about, from a flood and a melt point of view, we are almost all in the clear. There are some mountain snows that are slightly above average out in the upper Missouri Basin that are going to have to melt off, but we don't anticipate a lot of flooding from those. You know, we're just entering our wet season in most of this north central part of the U.S. So we're going to start seeing, you know, those May and June and late April, for that matter, rainstorms. Those all or any could cause flooding locally. Remember 1993, for example. Not that I want that to happen, but of the bulk of that precipitation was late spring, early summer. So we've seen wet conditions happen from here on out. We're not in the clear. We have a lot of areas with a lot of soil moisture, deep soil moisture, if you will. I think Pete showed that. But we're in a better situation than we certainly were a month and definitely 2 months ago in terms of that melt snow and frozen ground and all those other things that contribute to major flooding in the springtime. All right, so I want to kind of caveat all of our flooding discussions a little bit with that. And I don't know if Dennis or Pete want to add anything to that. No. Okay. Now, the questions. So, Dennis, I sent you a couple of them here. Yeah, thoughts on the chance of planting? We're talking mostly corn and soybeans, I think, at this point. We'll get done, excuse me, we'll get done by the end of May this year. In other words, the concern out there is that, like last year, that planting will be late because of wet soils, et cetera. Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, if I had the perfect answer, I would be off making a lot of money. That said, we are a little slow getting started. That's not a big issue. The cold temperatures right now are going to slow us down into next week before we start doing much progress. I think we're in reasonable shape to get most things planted by the end of May. There will probably still be, some soybeans that are going to be hanging over into June a little bit because we have such wet soils. The areas probably of biggest concern are the Dakotas, Minnesota. Areas south of there has been some drying of the soils. So as long as as long as the rains that come are not too excessive, we'll probably be able to make some slow progress. Right now, we don't necessarily see big excess of rainfalls coming, so I think we'll be okay. There was one more caveat that looking at some of the model things not predicted here, we have some chance of being a little cooler into early April. That, again, based on computer models, so that's not specific enough right now to say too much about that, but we could be a little slow from a cooler temperature standpoint. So we're much better than last year, much better situation than last year, but like on the flood situation, we're not completely out of the woods. There are a lot of things that could happen that could muck things up, but we're in a much better situation than we were last year.
Okay. And I think we had a question or a comment from South Dakota. Laura Edwards, the state climatologist there, saying that they're so wet up there still that chances of delays are quite possible or probable. Probably the best way to say that. Going down the list here, Dennis, that was number one. What was the second one? Here we go. Kansas Wheat Growers Association had a call last week. That wheat was 80 to 90% jointed, which means growing a lot and susceptible to freezes. And I think, yeah. So, Pete, I think you got some information from Mary Knapp in late today, late this morning. I don't know. I think they're assessing those conditions. Do you have anything else you want to say about that, or Dennis?
I would say that.
Sounds like a whining dog.
That was me. I'm sorry.
That's my way of getting out of answering questions is I have the dog whine. So my wife and I are both on calls at the same time here. So I'm doing dog duty.
Okay.
I would say that is the assessment right now is we're trying to figure out how bad this was. I think, Kansas is probably the farthest along and the most potential. I know we heard from Kentucky that there were probably some problems in Kentucky and some of the places in the southern part of the eastern corn belt. Winter wheat is not as big over there, but so we're still assessing. There has been some damage. We don't know the full extent of it yet.
I think they're under a freeze warning tonight too, right? Is that?
Well, we're having I hate to say this for some of you folks out there, but there's a major snowstorm, 6 to 10 inches in, it's unbelievable, 6 to 10 inches in northern Missouri, southern Iowa, potentially, and other places too, just in a kind of a narrow band. So it's more on the weather side than we usually talk about on this call. But yeah, it's still cold. But the weekend looks great.
From a balance standpoint, though, that precipitation was lined up with an area that has been dry more recently.
True.
So while we're not excited about getting snow in mid-April, the additional moisture might not be too bad there.
Dennis, here's another question for you, and actually maybe Pete as well. I don't know what's happening in Minnesota, but what happened to all the corn? Another question. What happened to all the corn that stayed in the field after hard frosts and arrived last fall? In other words, what happened to all the corn that was stuck in the field because of all the bad conditions they had up there?
Well,
Still being harvested.
Yep, they're still being harvested, and I don't know if it was mentioned last call, they were having trouble running into hibernating bears in the corn in northwestern Minnesota when they were
that's right,
when they were going through there. Once the snow is gone, they can get in there. So yeah, they're still trying to get it out.
And that's part of the additional problem up in, Laura talked about South Dakota, part of the North Dakota area. You have crops that are still sitting in the field that you have to get out. Then you have some field prep work you need to do, and then you still have to plant. So that's multiple things you have to do, and they're obviously more season limited than some of the rest of the Corn Belt. So that's going to continue to slow them down.
Yep, thank you.
And note that I've not heard anything on the yield results out of that. That is the thing, that corn can sit outside all winter and still be viable afterwards. I just haven't heard any reports on how much they've lost or how good the quality is.
Right. Thank you. Most of the people in the upper Mississippi Basin, this is more of a comment, are mostly worried due to about flooding issues, and the last thing they want to worry about is drought. Anybody have any tips on maintaining or emphasizing the importance of drought preparedness? I will simply comment that the best time to plan for drought is not in one, right? So the best time to plan for a drought is now, and we're wetter than heck, because we know it will happen. I really ought to have Molly Wozelin talk about that. I don't know if she's on the call. Let's see. No, she's not, but she is the National Integrated Drought Information System person that covers the Midwest. If you ever want her contact information, please feel free to contact me, and I'll give that to you. What are the prospects for corn still in the fields? I think we answered that. Mostly North and South Dakota. It will get picked. We don't know the quality. Obviously, there'll be a loss in yield, right, Dennis?
Yes, there will be. But the interesting thing that can happen, we had this happen about 10 years ago when I was in South Dakota, and I talked to some guys who harvested the corn that had been sitting out all year, and they had a similar situation. Their corn was very late. They were trying to let it dry down in the field, got too wet. They said they lost yield, but instead of having to dry it, it dried down in the field on its own. So while they lost some yield, there was less management of the corn they had to do afterwards. So they weren't too upset with the situation given what had happened.
Hey, Pete, can you back up one slide? There's a question that we can handle with one slide back.
Okay, hang on. This one?
Thanks. So we asked where the recording would be today, and it's those top two, either of the top two links there. One can go find the recordings as well as the PDF file eventually, not right now. I have to get this thing all situated. In the next 24 hours, you'll have the presentation, as the recorded presentation, as well as the PDF files. So really good question, and I'll probably try to answer this to some degree, and anybody else can help. Extended forecasts, the seasonal outlooks, the May, June, and July, and August, show the northern plains as either having mostly equal chances of being cooler, warmer, or near normal. And the question is, why is that showing up all the time? And maybe the oversimplified answer to that, Jerry, is that because we don't have obvious strong influences from things like, and you notice we didn't talk about El Nino or La Nina much on this call. The reason for that is we're in a very sort of neutral and I'll even say it slightly confusing pattern in the equatorial Pacific in terms of which way it may go into the future, either La Nina or El Nino this fall, or stay neutral. Those things have a big impact on the way those maps look. So when we don't have that, we tend to fall back on or put more, I'll put it this way, put more emphasis on things like trend. And the trend for average daily temperatures across that part of the country, all the way down to Nebraska and northern Missouri and most of the central part of the U.S., is for, in the summertime, is for normal to slightly even below normal temperatures. Now, it doesn't mean the minimum temperature will be low, but it usually means the high temperatures aren't as high as they could be. I'll put it that way. So that's sort of a trend that comes into it. If we don't have anything else to sort of base our forecasts on. Dennis, do you want to say any more about that?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. Yeah, some comment about how this reminds this freeze in the last few days reminds them of 2007. The one thing about that is it's probably not as deep into the south as 2007 was, but that's a good observation. Any insight on severe weather this season, and if Tornado Alley is sliding east? And I don't think I have anything I can add in answer to that. Anybody else?
Doug, can I chime in on the freeze part?
Yeah.
If anyone has reports from where they are on impacts of the freeze, we would be very happy to hear them, because we're trying to work with our partners, but we would like to have as broad an understanding of the impacts of the freeze as we can.
What Dennis is saying is if you're growing, if you have blossoming fruit trees that you harvest or whatever, send us an email, take a picture, whatever you want to do, or damage to other crops. There's a number of folks that can use that information and help inform others. Is that right, Dennis?
Yes. Okay. Or any kind of frost damage, freeze damage,
okay.
Excuse me.
Yep, even horticultural. So yield. Someone's asking if we could get yield data for those places. That would be very helpful. So, and maybe we can update that next month or send it directly to David if you want that. The National Drought Mitigation Center does do drought planning with a 25. It does do drought planning and is always working on that kind of stuff. So Brian Fuchs on the call is always someone you can contact if you want to continue your sort of resilience towards drought and know how to do that better. Wherever the webinar be posted, we got that. Just heard a report today that there is some mold and sprouting in corn in the field in South Dakota, which is surprising. It must have been warm up there, and it will get rejected at the elevator. North Dakota is just in a natural corn crib. Okay. Yeah, so no big danger of La Nina firing up this summer, apparently. Even if it did fire up this summer, we probably wouldn't feel a lot of effects from that, Bryce, until later in the year. Is the warm blob in the Pacific having an extended impact is the warm blob in the Pacific having an extended impact on the plains weather? Wow, that is a probably a $64,000 or $6 billion question. Go, Dennis.
Doug, did you address El Nino at all about some of the situation?
I said it. We're in the neutral pattern, and that's the outlook, and that we didn't draw a lot of forecast information from it.
Right. And because the other interesting thing that was discussed about transitioning to La Nina is that there's kind of a not much of an analog for being in an extended neutral pattern and then transitioning into a La Nina during the summertime. So that was why there was some skepticism about thinking that La Nina would start happening by late summer. I agree with the commenter. I don't think La Nina kicks up early enough. That there's limited chance of La Nina kicking up early enough to cause problems in the Corn Belt, increasing chance as we get into the fall.
and I'm not aware of how the warm blob, and I know what you're talking about in the Pacific is having an extended impact on the plains weather. I'm not familiar enough to say anything other than I believe the warm blob is a little bit more shallow than it has been in the past, and we can get into all kinds of conversations on that. Any other comments about that in particular? Okay. That pretty much wraps it up. Pete and Dennis, I want to say thank you very much, and you guys can have the last word if you like in terms of any extra comments or warnings or things for people to watch for.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing maybe 70s are in the forecast next week, so I'm hearing rumors about that. So we'll be thrilled if that happens.
Yeah, don't worry, folks. Spring is coming. I will forecast that. Spring is coming.
The Minnesotans only know rumors about 70-degree temperatures.
That's about right.
That's right. Hey, thanks everybody. Stay well out there. Very much appreciate you all hanging in here to the bitter end. And sorry about some of the issues early on. We'll be back next month with Dennis, our commenter. Dennis Toddy going to be the presenter. Again, if you need any other information, feel free to contact any one of us at any time. We're still doing our jobs. Thank you. Have a great weekend.